Sometimes it takes just one quiet voice on a noisy flight to remind the world what courage really looks like. It was a Thursday morning like any other in Dallas. The skies stretched wide and open, painted in that soft blue Texans know so well. Out at Love Field Airport, the scent of coffee and airplane fuel mingled in the air. Families, business travelers, and retirees bustled past Gate 14 boarding a Southwest flight bound for Atlanta. Nobody knew it yet, but that flight was about to carry more than passengers. It was about to carry a story. Among the crowd, a modest-looking black woman stepped forward with her son. Her name was Angela Washington. Late 30s, tired eyes, the kind of woman who's worked 2 jobs her whole life and still manages to smile at strangers. She was dressed simple blue jeans, a cardigan too thin for the air conditioning, and worn-out sneakers that had seen 1,000 12-hour shifts. Beside her was Caleb, her 8-year-old son, a quiet boy with big, steady eyes and a backpack twice his size. While most kids fidgeted or stared at tablets, Caleb held his mom's hand like it was something sacred. They walked down the jet bridge without drawing attention, just another mother and son. No fanfare, no drama. But in that stillness, there was something else, a weight, a silence that carried stories untold. Their assigned seats were near the back window and middle. The aisle was already occupied by a man in his 60s, Mr. Richard Halbert. He wore an expensive golf jacket, gold cufflinks, and the kind of smirk that suggested he'd never had to stand in line for anything in his life. Angela spoke gently. "Excuse me, sir. We're in here." He didn't move at first, just looked up, raised an eyebrow, and slowly got to his feet. "Figures," he muttered, shaking his head. "Always the window in the middle, huh?" Angela didn't respond. She just smiled politely, helping Caleb into the window seat. The moment passed, at least it seemed that way, but then it happened. Angela, rubbing her back, asked the flight attendant softly, "Would you mind helping me lift my bag overhead? I've had some spinal pain from work." That's when Mr. Halbert leaned back in his seat loud enough for everyone in row 19 to hear. Of course. Special treatment. One rule for the rest of us, another for you people. A sharp silence followed, the kind of silence that slices through the hum of airplane engines. The flight attendant froze. Angela's face turned still. But it was Caleb, this little boy, barely 4 feet tall, who turned and stared at the man. Not in anger, not in fear, but with something older, something stronger. The kind of stare that says, "I've read about men like you, and I know exactly what to do." And as the airplane taxied down the runway, what no one realized was that this child, this quiet, brown-skinned boy with a second-hand backpack, was about to turn this entire flight into a courtroom and leave a nation talking. Because sometimes the smallest voice becomes the loudest legacy. The wheels of the plane hadn't even left the tarmac, and already something had shifted in the air. Not the cabin pressure, but something colder, something older. Caleb sat quietly in his window seat, legs barely reaching the floor, while his mother Angela gently massaged her back. The overhead bin was now closed thanks to the help of a kind flight attendant, but the damage had already been done. Not physical damage. Not yet. This was the kind that started small, like a crack in the glass that spreads when no one's watching. And it all started with a single sentence. "You people always think you deserve special treatment," Mr. Halbert said again, this time more loudly, as if trying to gather an audience. A hush fell over rows 18 through 22. Heads turned slightly, phones were lowered, but no one said a word. Not a single voice rose in defense, not yet. Angela shifted in her seat, quietly murmuring, "Caleb, it's okay. Just breathe." But Caleb wasn't looking at her. He was staring forward, his eyes fixed on the back of the seat ahead as if reading invisible letters. His fingers tapped softly against the armrest. 1, 2, 3. The same rhythm his dad used when arguing a case in court, or so his mother once told him. Meanwhile, Mr. Halbert wasn't done. He leaned back in his seat, arms folded. You know, he said to no one in particular back in my day, folks had a little respect. They didn't go around expecting handouts or special rules just because they were tired or sore or whatever. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. An older woman beside him shot a glance toward Caleb and Angela, but quickly looked away. And just like that, the words kept coming, like a leak that no one bothered to patch. I paid for this seat like everybody else. I didn't ask for a performance. If she can't handle a bag, maybe she shouldn't be flying. The flight attendant returned, tall, young, a little flushed in the cheeks. Sir, she said firmly, I'd like to ask that you speak respectfully to other passengers. Mr. Halbert gave a half smile. I'm being truthful, young lady. There's a difference. If they can't handle the truth, well, that's not my fault. Angela sat still, eyes forward. Years of nursing had taught her how to keep calm under pressure. But Caleb could feel it, the tightening in her fingers, the way she didn't blink. That wasn't calm. That was survival. Then came the final spark. As the plane finished boarding and the last announcements played overhead, Mr. Halbert leaned just slightly toward Angela and said with a hushed sneer, Maybe if you people spent less time whining and more time working, you wouldn't need so much help. This time it was loud enough for half the plane to hear, loud enough that the silence afterward felt heavy like. The cabin lights had dimmed by more than a switch. Caleb slowly turned his head toward the man, and he spoke not loudly, not with anger, just plainly, clearly. Sir, are you aware that the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986 protects passengers with physical limitations, and that asking for assistance isn't special treatment, it's a legal right? Mr. Halbert blinked. Once. Twice. Caleb continued. My mom works 12-hour shifts helping people who can't even get out of bed. She's never asked for anything free. She just asked for kindness. There was a stillness. Then someone in the row behind whispered, Go on, son. Another voice, deeper, older, added, Kids got more backbone than half the adults I know. Mr. Halbert opened his mouth, but no words came. Just a flushed face, a twitch in his jaw. Caleb leaned back, adjusted his seatbelt, and looked out the window. The flight hadn't taken off yet, but in the minds of every passenger nearby, something already had a shift. A realization. That this wasn't just a boy and his mother. This was a mirror being held up. And not everyone liked what they saw. Silence settled in row 19 like a fog. The kind that doesn't just land in your ears, it lands on your heart. Mr. Halbert stared at Caleb like he had just been challenged to a duel. But there was no swordplay here, no raised voices, no childish tantrum. Just an 8-year-old boy seated quietly beside his mother who had spoken the truth and spoken it with the clarity of a courtroom veteran. Angela reached over, touched Caleb's hand. It was her gentle way of asking, Are you sure? But Caleb gave the faintest nod. He was sure. With a voice that still held the softness of a child, but carried the weight of something bigger, he continued. Sir, the Air Carrier Access Act was passed to prevent exactly this kind of treatment discrimination against people with temporary or permanent disabilities. Asking for assistance isn't a favor, it's part of federal compliance under DOT regulations. Someone 2 rows ahead turned and whispered to his wife, Did he just say federal compliance? Caleb wasn't done. I've read the act. Section 382.111 of Title 14. Code of Federal Regulations states that passengers with disabilities are entitled to timely assistance with boarding, deplaning, and storing carry-ons. Mr. Halbert's mouth opened slightly, but again no words came, and Caleb added verbal harassment toward a disabled passenger or their family could result in removal from the aircraft at the captain's discretion. Now that got people's attention. Several phones were discreetly lifted into recording position. Not in a malicious way, but because people knew something remarkable was unfolding. Not viral, not clickbait, just important. Angela looked at her son with disbelief and pride mixing behind her eyes like storm clouds clearing after heavy rain. Mr. Halbert, meanwhile, leaned back stiffly in his seat. "Two don't need a lecture from a child," he muttered. Caleb, calm as ever, replied, "I'm not lecturing. I'm informing. There's a difference." A low chuckle came from across the aisle. An older black man in his 70s wearing a cowboy hat and a bolo tie tipped his hat toward Caleb and said, "Son, you're something else." The flight attendant who had been hovering nearby stepped in. "Sir," she said to Mr. Halbert, voice firmer, "now we take these matters seriously. If you continue speaking disrespectfully to our passengers, I will have to notify the captain. Mr. Halbert waved her off. "Whatever. This is ridiculous." But the damage was done, and not by Mr. Halbert, by Caleb. Because suddenly people weren't just watching. They were rethinking how they had stayed silent, rethinking what it meant to mind your business when injustice whispered into row 19. Caleb turned slightly and looked out the window. His voice softened almost like he was speaking to himself. "My dad used to say the law doesn't protect the loudest voice. It protects the quietest truth." Angela's breath caught in her chest. For a moment, she was back at the funeral 5 years ago. Her husband, Marcus Washington, had been a civil rights attorney in Houston. Caleb had only been 3 when he passed, but somehow he had remembered everything. Every book, every late-night talk, every courtroom story. "Where'd you learn all this, young man?" a middle-aged woman asked from 2 rows back. Caleb turned. "From my dad's books. He taught me the law wasn't about knowing everything, it was about standing for someone who couldn't stand alone." Another silence followed, but this one was different. This silence was reverent. And then the unexpected happened. The plane's intercom clicked on. It was the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said before we take off, "I want to thank a very special passenger aboard this flight. Young man in row 19, you reminded all of us what it means to speak truth with courage. That's a lesson this country could use a little more of these days." Applause broke out, not loud and rowdy, but respectful. "Sincere." Caleb didn't smile. He just nodded slightly, then looked at his mother, who had tears in her eyes. In that moment, nothing about Caleb seemed like a child, and yet he wasn't trying to be an adult either. He was just himself, a boy, a son, a student of justice. And as the plane finally lifted off the ground, slicing through the Texas sky on its way to Georgia, it carried more than just passengers. It carried a truth, a legacy, and the first spark of a story that was only just beginning. The flight had leveled off at 30,000 feet. Outside the window, the clouds stretched across the sky like folds of white cotton, peaceful calm. But inside row 19, something heavier lingered. Not tension anymore, no. That had passed. What lingered now was curiosity, reverence, and a strange collective wonder about the boy who had silenced a grown man with nothing but his words. Angela looked over at Caleb. He had gone quiet again, chewing lightly on the strap of his backpack, eyes staring out the window. But she knew that look. It wasn't boredom. It was reflection. It always started like this when he thought about his father. A woman across the aisle leaned in with a gentle smile. "If you don't mind me asking, ma'am, where did he learn all that?" Angela let out a soft breath, then smiled, not wide, but wistfully. "From his daddy. He was quite a man." And just like that, the cabin faded for her. The soft hum of the engines became background to a memory stronger than steel. Flashback, 7 years earlier, Houston, Texas. Marcus Washington wasn't a tall man. He wasn't loud either. But when he walked into a courtroom, people straightened up. Judges listened closer. Opponents double-checked their paperwork. He didn't win cases with volume. He won them with precision, with compassion wrapped in confidence. And at home, he was even more powerful. He used to sit Caleb on his lap and read the Constitution like it was a bedtime story. He taught Caleb how the Bill of Rights wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a shield. Even a poor black man with no money and no friends has a voice, he'd say. The law can carry that voice if you know how to lift it. Angela remembered those nights. Marcus would come home after 12-hour trials and still have time to kneel beside Caleb's bed and answer questions like, "Daddy, why are some people mean to us?" And Marcus would reply, "Because they're scared of what they don't understand." And nothing scares the powerful more than a smart little boy who knows his worth. Back on the plane, Angela spoke quietly to the woman across the aisle. Marcus passed 5 years ago. Cancer. He didn't get to see Caleb grow up, but he left his books, his journals, his example. Caleb turned to her now. "You think he'd be proud?" Mama Angela blinked quickly. Her hand went to his face, brushing his cheek like she had when he was a baby. "Your daddy would have stood up and clapped louder than anyone, baby." A man from 3 rows up who had overheard leaned back and said, "Well, if he was anything like you, son, he must have been a damn fine man." Angela chuckled softly. He was, and stubborn as a mule. Caleb laughed. He used to say, "If justice takes too long, you march it home yourself." The older cowboy in the bolo tie, who hadn't said much since tipping his hat, nodded again. "That man was raised right, and looks like he passed it on." Angela's voice dropped a little. "We didn't always have much, sometimes no electricity. But Marcus made sure we always had books. He said knowledge was how poor folks punch above their weight." The flight attendant standing nearby now spoke up. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but this is the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed on a flight." Angela smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "We're just living our story." But Caleb wasn't done remembering. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn leather notebook. It was cracked at the edges, the pages yellowed. On the first page was a name written in bold blue ink, Marcus Elijah, Washington Trial Notes and Reflections. Caleb opened to the middle. "This is the page Daddy wrote the day he lost his last big case. He thought he'd let his client down." Angela tilted her head. "Read it, baby." Caleb cleared his throat. "A man is not judged by the number of cases he wins, but by the number of people he stands up for, even when the world is too afraid to stand beside him." Silence again. But this silence didn't hurt. It healed. Around them, passengers were no longer just seat numbers and carry-ons. They were witnesses. Witnesses to legacy, to history, to a father's echo living on in the clear, unwavering voice of an 8-year-old boy 30,000 feet in the sky. And somewhere, maybe in a quiet corner of heaven, Marcus Washington smiled, knowing that justice still had a voice. And his son had found it. Sometimes injustice doesn't scream, it simmers. It waits in silence, stacking insult on top of insult until one final drop breaks the dam. For Angela and Caleb, that drop came 25 minutes into the flight. The plane had reached cruising altitude. The beverage cart had started rolling. Conversations resumed, murmurs filled the cabin, and the drama of the boarding gate began to fade into memory for some. But not for Mr. Halbert. He sat 2 rows behind Caleb, arms crossed, breathing through his nose like a bull about to charge. Every so often he'd mutter something under his breath. "This whole thing's a joke," or "Some people sure know how to play victim." Angela heard it. Caleb did too. But they said nothing. After all, hadn't they won? Hadn't. Caleb already turned an entire flight into a classroom. But bullies don't quit when they lose. They simmer, and they wait. The flight attendant returned with a tray of drinks. She handed Caleb his apple juice and smiled. That's when it happened. Mr. Halbert scoffed loudly. "Oh, sure, let's treat the little prince like he's testifying before Congress. Maybe bring him a crown next." It was louder than before, clearer, intentional. A few passengers turned. The woman across from Angela gasped softly. Caleb lowered his juice. Angela turned her head slowly, meeting Mr. Halbert's eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice low and calm, "you're harassing my son." Mr. Halbert raised his hands mockingly. Oh no, don't say that. He might sue me with his big boy words and legal books. Chuckles came from two young men seated nearby, nervous, confused. They weren't siding with him, but they weren't sure whether to stop it either. Angela took a deep breath. That was the moment. The final straw. She stood, slowly, with dignity, with 30 years of silence carried in her bones. I wasn't going to say anything more, she began, voice calm but firm. I was going to let your words pass, like I've done in restaurants, in stores, in hospital parking lots at midnight, but not today. The cabin quieted. You see my son here? She pointed gently to Caleb. He's 8 years old, and he just stood up for the law for his mother and for every person who's ever been humiliated for asking for help. Caleb looked up at her, eyes wide. A different kind of wide, not fear, but awe. Angela continued. You think you're insulting him, but all you've done is show this plane who he really is and who you really are. Gasps rippled softly through the cabin. I am a nurse, she said. I've changed the dressings of men who wouldn't speak to me in public. I've held the hands of mothers losing children who still looked at me like I didn't belong in their room. But I still showed up. Every shift, every night. Because I believe people can be better. She turned slightly, addressing the cabin. I don't want revenge. I don't need an apology, but I will not let another black child think that silence is strength, that compliance is the same thing as peace. At that moment, the older man in the bolo tie stood voice steady, and neither will we. He turned toward the flight attendant. Mom, he said, this gentleman is creating an unsafe environment for a child. I believe airline policy allows for reporting that directly to the captain. The flight attendant blinked, then nodded. Yes, sir. It does. Mr. Halbert stood up angry. This is ridiculous. You people are all ganging up on me just because he stopped himself. Too late. The you people echoed like a hammer in the cabin. The young man across the aisle stood now too. Sir, with all due respect, sit down. You've embarrassed yourself enough. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received a report of passenger misconduct. If the situation cannot be resolved immediately, we will be returning to the gate. That did it. Mr. Halbert slumped into his seat. He didn't apologize. But he didn't speak again either. Angela sat down, heart still racing. Caleb looked at her. Mama, I didn't know you could talk like that. Angela smiled, tears threatening to fall. I didn't know I still had it in me. He reached for her hand, and in the quiet that followed, something unspoken passed between them. Power. Not the kind you shout. Not the kind that punishes. But the kind that endures. The kind that survives. And that day, 30,000 feet in the sky, injustice didn't just get challenged. It got silenced. The air inside that aircraft was thick not with pressure or turbulence, but with the kind of stillness that comes right after thunder. Everyone was waiting. Watching, listening for what would happen next. The captain's voice had already made things clear. If the situation cannot be resolved immediately, we will be returning to the gate. But it wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge. Would the adults on board rise to the occasion? Would someone else escalate? Or would the courage of a mother and her child be enough to steer that flight and the hearts of the people back on course? Angela sat upright, her hand still in Caleb's. Mr. Halbert had gone quiet, his face flushed crimson, glaring out the window like a man searching for a horizon that had long passed him by. The flight attendant returned, kneeling slightly at Caleb's row. Sweetheart, she said gently, the captain wants to know if you're all right. Caleb nodded. Yes, ma'am. I'm fine. But the flight attendant didn't leave. She looked at Angela and then back at Caleb. Actually, he'd like to meet you. A few heads turned. One woman whispered, Wait, the captain? Angela blinked. Up front. In the cockpit, the attendant smiled. No, not midair, but when we land. He asked if he could shake Caleb's hand personally. Caleb's eyes widened. Really? You've done something very few people do, she added. You stood up, spoke truth, and made people listen. The captain says he wants to thank you. A hush fell again. But this time it wasn't heavy, it was respectful. Then clapping. Just one person at first, the older man in the bolo tie, slow and steady. Then the woman across the aisle joined in. Then a couple behind Caleb. Then, row by row, the cabin filled with the rhythmic applause of passengers, young and old, black and white, loud and quiet, all standing behind one small boy and his mother. Caleb sat frozen for a moment. Angela leaned close. Go ahead, baby. You earned that. He turned, stood in the narrow aisle, and gave the smallest of bows. Nothing grand, just enough to say thank you. Mr. Halbert didn't clap, didn't move. But no one looked at him anymore. The applause wasn't against him. It was for Caleb, and that made all the difference. The captain's voice returned softer this time. Ladies and gentlemen, we are continuing our flight to Atlanta as scheduled. And I just want to say sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They wear backpacks and speak the truth. More applause followed, louder, even a whistle or two. Caleb looked at his mom. Did that just happen? Angela laughed. Yes, baby, that just happened. As the flight settled into calm once again, something changed in the energy of the cabin. Strangers became neighbors. Conversations bloomed where silence had lived. And across the aisle, passengers began asking Angela questions. Not intrusive ones, but curious, grateful ones. What books does he read? Was his dad really a lawyer? Can you believe how composed he was? Angela answered every question with grace, always looping the credit back to Caliban, to Marcus, the man who had started this story long before the plane had left the ground. Caleb, meanwhile, looked out the window again, but this time not in silence. He was humming, and that hum held peace, power, purpose. It was the sound of a boy who had been heard, and a mother who had been seen. When the flight attendant came back one last time with a warm cookie from first class, she handed it to Caleb with a smile. We usually reserve these for VIPs, she said, but I think you qualify. Caleb looked at the cookie, then at his mom. Can I share it with you? Angela nodded. Of course. They broke it in half-passing pieces between them. And in that small, act-quiet, simple sweet was everything they had fought for. Respect, dignity, family. And though the engines roared on and the clouds rolled by below, nothing in that moment was louder than the silence of injustice, finally defeated. As the seatbelt sign dinged on, and the wheels of the plane dropped beneath them, there was a sense of quiet anticipation in the air. Not the usual restlessness of passengers preparing to disembark, but something deeper, something reverent. Angela reached across Caleb to pull down the window shade, but Caleb stopped her. Can we leave it open, Mama? I want to see us land. She smiled. Of course, baby. From his window seat, Caleb gazed down at the patchwork of Atlanta suburbs, slowly drawing closer, glowing in the golden haze of afternoon. He leaned forward, nose nearly against the glass. Angela watched him for a moment, her heart full. 5 hours earlier, they were just another mother and son taking a flight. Now, her 8-year-old had become the voice of calm in a storm. The protector, the teacher, the little boy his father would have been proud of. The landing was smooth, but the moment the wheels touched down, a ripple of energy moved through the cabin. Soft applause again. It started near the back this time, subtle and respectful, as if the passengers understood they were no longer just on Flight 82 to Atlanta. They'd been part of something bigger, something worth remembering. As the plane rolled to the gate and the chime signaled arrival, the captain's voice returned once more, this time gentler, warmer. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the flight crew, I want to thank you for your patience today and for witnessing something remarkable. Young Mr. Caleb Washington, if you and your mother wouldn't mind waiting a moment, we'd love to greet you up front. Gasps, smiles, nods all around. The moment the cabin door opened, a flight attendant gently gestured toward the aisle. "You first, Caleb," she said. "The captain's waiting." Caleb turned to his mother, eyes wide. Angela straightened his backpack and whispered, "Shoulders up. Heart forward." He walked slowly down the aisle, and as he passed, each row offered him something. A nod, a smile, a thank you, a pat on the back. And then just before he reached the cockpit door, everyone stood. The entire plane, like an impromptu standing ovation for a boy who reminded them all what courage really looked like. Even Mr. Halbert, still seated in row 21, dropped his eyes and said nothing. At the front, the captain, tall, silver-haired, with deep creases from years of service, knelt slightly to meet Caleb eye to eye. "Young man," he said, "in all my years, flying I've seen weather delays, mechanical failures, and everything in between. But I've never seen an 8-year-old command a plane's respect like that." Caleb looked up. "Thank you, sir. I just didn't want my mom to feel small." The captain smiled, visibly moved. "You did more than that, son. You lifted all of us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small gold pin, the kind usually reserved for junior flyers, but this one had wings engraved with "Honor Passenger." "We don't give these out often," he said. "But if anyone's earned it today, it's you." Caleb accepted it slowly, tears pooling at the edge of his lashes. Angela finally caught up behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder. The captain looked at her. "Mom, thank you for raising him right." Angela exhaled, tears brimming in her own eyes. "I didn't raise him alone." Back in the terminal, passengers began to go their separate ways, but not before several turned back one last time to wave at Caleb. An elderly black woman with a cane whispered, "You gave me hope, baby." A white Vietnam veteran in uniform muttered, "Your daddy must have been one hell of a man." And with every comment, every smile, Caleb stood a little taller. For once, the world wasn't too big for him. It fit. And as they walked down the corridor toward baggage claim, hand in hand, Angela whispered, "You didn't just land in Atlanta today, Caleb. You arrived in the world, and you landed with purpose. Some stories end when the plane lands, but this one, it just began." Back in Fort Worth, Texas, the skies were calm, and the breeze smelled like cut grass and summer coming early. Caleb sat on the porch beside his mom's legs, swinging Honor Passenger pin still fastened proudly on his shirt. The same shirt he wore on that fateful flight. But now it fit differently, like it belonged to someone older, someone bigger inside. Angela handed him a glass of lemonade. He took a sip and stared out into the yard where his daddy used to practice closing arguments to the trees. "Mama," he said quietly, "why do people act mean when no one stops them?" Angela smiled. "Because they think silence means agreement. Like that man on the plane." She nodded. "Exactly like that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad I said something." Angela looked at her son, only 8 years old and already braver than most men twice his age. "You didn't just say something, baby," she said, voice warm. "You became someone. Someone who carries light into dark places." The week after the flight, something changed, not just in Caleb, but in how others saw him. At school, his classmates listened more closely when he spoke. His teacher began calling on him when discussions turned to what's fair. Even the principal pulled Angela aside and said, "We'd like Caleb to lead the Pledge of Allegiance next month. He's got something special." Angela was proud, of course, but more than that, she was grateful. Grateful that Marcus's spirit lived on. Grateful that the books he left behind now sat open on Caleb's desk, underlined in blue crayon and highlighter. Grateful that her son didn't wait until adulthood to learn what it meant to stand for justice. One Sunday after church, an older gentleman, a Vietnam veteran in full uniform, walked up to Angela and said, "Mom, I saw the news. That boy of yours reminded me of why I wore the uniform. He didn't back down, not even when it was hard." Angela thanked him, holding back tears, because in her heart she knew Caleb hadn't just spoken for her. He spoke for everybody who ever sat down, stayed quiet, swallowed pain just to avoid making waves. He had broken that silence with something stronger than anger. He had broken it with truth. Caleb's story reminds us all that strength doesn't always come with size or age, it comes with clarity. When we raise children with values rooted in justice, when we tell them where they come from and what they're capable of, we arm them with something no bully, no prejudice, no narrow mind can take away. His courage wasn't born on that flight. It was grown, nurtured in bedtime stories of Malcolm X and Thurgood Marshall, fed through gentle words from a mother who never let the world define her son before he could define himself. It shows us that the real measure of legacy is not in what we accumulate, but in what we instill. And that legacy isn't something we pass down only when we're gone. It's something we build every time we look a child in the eye and say, "You have a voice, and it matters." That moment on the plane, it was about more than justice. It was about awakening, a spark, a standard, a seed of leadership planted before the age of 10. And now, that seed is growing. Have you ever witnessed a young child do something wise, brave, or profoundly kind, so much so that it silenced a room full of adults? Something that reminded you of what truly matters. Do you believe courage like Caleb's is something we're born with, or something we're taught? Let us know in the comments below. Because when we share stories like these, we don't just reflect on what's good, we multiply it.